322 comments on a goodbye post. Not for a star, not for a veteran who gave the franchise a decade of her life, for a player who barely saw the court. A player who, by every measurable standard available, was doing exactly what Indiana needed her to do every time she stepped on the floor. And the fan base didn't just respond with frustration, they responded with something that cuts deeper than anger. They responded with resignation, with a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from watching an organization make the same category of mistake over and over again. Except this time, the stakes are higher than they have ever been in the history of this franchise, because this time, Caitlin Clark is in the building, and the decisions being made around her are not decisions being made by an organization that understands what it has. What happened in Indiana in that 24-hour window is not a small story. It is not a routine roster move buried in the middle of a long season. It is a moment that crystallized everything the fan base has been watching build all year. The pattern, the priorities, the philosophy underneath the decisions that keep getting made regardless of what the numbers say. Kennedy Carter, gone. Justine Prasad, gone. Both of them landing in Las Vegas, a franchise that will actually use them. And the player who stayed, the one whose spot was never in question no matter what the metrics said, is still collecting minutes in Indiana, while the coaches talk about culture and the wins refuse to come at the rate this roster should be producing them. That is not a coincidence. That is a direction. And the 322 people who flooded that goodbye post are telling you exactly what they think about where that direction leads. To understand why this hit the fan base the way it did, you have to understand what these two players actually were before Indiana decided they were expendable. Start with Kennedy Carter, because her arc this season is one of the stranger stories in the league. Earlier this year, she was averaging 15 points per game in 20 minutes of playing time. Let that register, 15 points in 20 minutes. She was shooting the ball with better efficiency than Kelsey Mitchell at certain points in the season. For a bench player operating in a limited role, those are not just good numbers. Those are the kind of numbers that make a front office look smart for finding her, that make a coaching staff look competent for using her correctly, that make a fan base feel like the depth of the roster is real and not illusory. Then something changed. She started missing games. The organization said she was sick. The fan base didn't buy it, and they were vocal about not buying it. The real story of what happened behind the scenes has not been told publicly. Nobody from the organization has offered anything resembling a clear explanation. What the public knows is the sequence of events. She was producing at an elite rate. Then she stopped playing. Then she was gone. Not traded for value, just gone. Headed to Las Vegas to play for Becky Hammon and contribute to an Aces roster that was already dangerous before Indiana handed them a player averaging 15 per game. Indiana received nothing in return. That is not a basketball decision. That is something else, and the fans are not pretending otherwise. Justine Prasad's situation is in some ways even harder to justify because the numbers she put up in the limited minutes she was given make the decision to waive her almost impossible to explain through any basketball lens. 12 points per game, 60% from the field, 52% from three-point range, in just under 17 minutes per game. Those are not development numbers. Those are not the numbers of a player who needs more time to prove she belongs. Those are the numbers of a player who is already proving it every time she gets on the court, who is producing at an elite efficiency level in a role that the Indiana Fever's offensive system should desperately want. Clark finds shooters. That is one of the foundational elements of what makes her dangerous. A player shooting 52% from three in 17 minutes is exactly the kind of player you build minutes around when your offensive engine is a creative playmaking guard who draws defensive attention the way Clark does. And Indiana waived her, not traded her for value, not shopped her around the league to see what she could bring back, waived her. And the Aces picked her up immediately because competent organizations recognized what Indiana apparently could not.
And then there is Erica Dottis. This is the part of the conversation that the fan base keeps returning to because the contrast between her roster security and what happened to Prasad and Carter is the most visible evidence of whatever the actual decision-making framework is in Indiana right now. Dottis is shooting worse than at any point in her career. The defensive metrics around her performance have been described as brutal by people who pull the actual numbers rather than relying on the eye test, though the eye test is not kind to her either. She is, by the assessment of multiple observers who have watched this team closely, possibly the worst defender currently getting consistent rotation minutes in the league. That is not a fringe opinion being floated by people with an agenda. It is the conclusion that the available data supports and that watching her defend in real time consistently reinforces. Here is what makes this genuinely strange rather than just frustrating. Dottis was actually better last year under Christy Sides than she is this year under Stephanie White. That is not a matter of interpretation, that is in the statistical record. Something changed when the coaching staff changed, and the change did not benefit her. Her production declined, her defensive performance declined, her overall contribution to winning basketball declined, and yet her roster spot has never been in question. She has been protected in a way that Carter and Prasad, both of whom were producing at higher rates in their roles, were not. The fans have a theory about why. Several of them said it out loud in the comments section, and while some of the phrasing got pointed enough that it crossed lines, the underlying question they were asking is a legitimate one. What is the actual basketball reason that a player shooting 52% from three cannot get 15 minutes a game when the player currently occupying that part of the rotation is performing at the level Dottis is performing at? Nobody from the organization has provided one. Stephanie White talks about culture, she talks about fit, she talks about veterans setting the tone, but none of that language, however many times it gets deployed in press conferences, explains the specific roster construction choices being made in Indiana right now. The destination those two players landed at is not a minor footnote in this story. It is one of the most clarifying data points available about the gap between what Indiana is building and what a functional, winning basketball organization looks like in practice. Justine Prasad and Kennedy Carter both went to the Las Vegas Aces. The Aces are owned by Mark Davis and Tom Brady. Between them, those two men have 7 Super Bowl rings. Tom Brady alone has 7. This is not an ownership group that tolerates losing, that accepts mediocrity as a process, or that builds organizational culture around anything other than winning championships. Becky Hammon is the head coach. Hammon is not just a good WNBA coach. She is a coach who several years ago was being seriously considered for NBA head coaching positions because of the work she did as one of the top assistants in the entire league under Greg Popovich in San Antonio. Multiple NBA teams looked at her. The reports from that period were not speculation. They were specific, documented, and based on Hammon's actual reputation inside the league as a basketball mind of the highest order. That is the organization that now has Justine Prasad. That is the environment she is walking into, compared to sitting on the bench in Indiana watching the rotation play out in ways that her production did not justify. That is not just an upgrade for her personally, that is a completely different tier of professional experience, competitive environment, and organizational seriousness. And the Indiana Fever fan base, which has watched their organization operate at a level well below that tier for the better part of a decade, understands the contrast immediately and viscerally. The comments under that goodbye post were not just about Prasad, they were about what her departure represents. Proof, delivered in the clearest possible terms, that Indiana is not operating at the level its most important player deserves. 322 comments. And what those comments actually said matters, because they were not uniform anger. They were something more revealing than that. They were a portrait of a fan base that has moved past frustration into a specific kind of clarity about what they're watching. Some of them were pointed about the basketball decisions. Why are you keeping the worst defender on the roster while cutting players who can score? What is the actual reason Prasad couldn't crack the rotation? When Clark and Mitchell are your backcourt, you need shooters and defenders around them. That is not controversial. That is just the math of how the modern game works. And Indiana is cutting the shooters.
Some of them went further, into territory that was harder to dismiss even if the specific phrasing sometimes made people uncomfortable. The word that kept appearing, the word that multiple commenters landed on independently, was culture. Not as a compliment, as a question. What does culture actually mean in Indiana right now? Because based on the observable decisions, who stays, who goes, who gets minutes, regardless of what the numbers say, it does not appear to mean winning basketball games. It appears to mean something else, something that the coaches and front office have not defined clearly, and that the fan base is now defining for themselves based on the evidence available to them. And the definitions they are arriving at are not flattering to the organization. But the comment that should actually scare Indiana, the one that cuts through everything else and gets to the real stakes, is not the angry one or the pointed one, it is the simple one. Caitlin, get out before they brainwash you too. That is not a troll. That sentiment was not coming from people who just discovered this team or who are looking for content to engage with. It was coming from the core fan base, the people who have been watching Indiana basketball through years of losing seasons, the people who suffered through roster decisions that made no sense and coaching choices that went nowhere, and a franchise identity built on potential that never materialized into wins. Those people finally had a reason to believe something was genuinely different. They had Caitlin Clark, and now they are watching the organization make decisions that feel identical to every bad decision that came before, except now the cost of those decisions is not just another disappointing season, it is the possible waste of a generational talent's prime. Clark's return announcement landed in the middle of all of this, and even that came with a layer of complication that the fan base noticed immediately. She said she was very hopeful to be available against the Sparks. She said she would likely be on a minutes restriction, aiming for just over 20 minutes if she felt good enough to go. Standard injury return language, nothing alarming on its surface. But then she said this, not from a health standpoint. Well, obviously a health standpoint, but just getting back into it. Read that again. Not from a health standpoint. Well, obviously a health standpoint, but just getting back into it. That is not the quote of a player who is fully aligned with the decision being made about her return timeline. That is the quote of someone who is trying to explain a situation in real time, who started down one path and then caught herself, who is navigating the space between what she actually thinks and what she can say publicly. Whether that reading is entirely accurate or whether it was simply a clumsy phrasing in the moment is a matter of interpretation. But in the context of everything else happening around her, it landed exactly the way the fan base read it, as someone who is managing more than just a physical recovery. The scheduling reality added another layer of tension to the whole thing. Indiana plays the Sparks on Wednesday. They play the Aces on Thursday, back-to-back. Clark basically said she probably cannot play both. So the fans started doing the math themselves, the same way they always do when the organization does not give them straight answers. The network carrying the Aces game wants her available for that one. That is the marquee matchup, especially if A'ja Wilson returns for Las Vegas. That is the game the league wants, the game that television executives want, the game that moves the needle for women's basketball nationally. But if Clark can only play one of the two games, who makes that decision and based on what priority? Her long-term health and the team's competitive future, or the broadcast schedule and what the league office prefers for ratings? That question should not be a complicated one for an organization that genuinely has Clark's best interests and the team's competitive future as its primary concern. The fact that it feels like a genuine question, given everything else happening in Indiana right now, is itself a problem.
Step back and look at what Indiana's backcourt situation actually is right now. Because when you lay it out plainly, the roster construction becomes very difficult to defend. Kennedy Carter is gone. She was averaging 15 points per game before whatever happened behind the scenes removed her from the equation. Justine Prasad is gone. She was shooting 52% from three in under 17 minutes before Indiana decided she did not fit the culture. Caitlin Clark is coming back on a minutes restriction, likely playing around 20 minutes against the Sparks before the organization decides how to handle the back-to-back. Kelsey Mitchell is logging heavy minutes as the primary offensive option during Clark's absence, which means she is carrying a load that will compound the fatigue she is already dealing with at this point in the season. And Erica Dottis, the player whose production metrics justify none of the security she has been given, is still in the rotation.
That is the backcourt Indiana is running. That is the depth chart heading into a stretch of games that matters for where this team lands in the standings and what their playoff positioning looks like. And the coaching staff is going to put Clark on a 20-minute restriction while Dottis logs her rotation minutes. And the fans are going to watch that happen in real time, and they are going to lose their minds. Not because they are unreasonable, because they have seen this movie before. They watched Christy Sides mismanage rotations last year. They watched the front office make draft decisions and personnel moves that did not reflect an organization with a clear competitive vision. They watched the same conversations happen in the comment sections and the fan forums and the post-game threads, the same frustrations cycle through without producing meaningful change. And now they are watching it happen again. Except this time, the player being mismanaged is not a promising young talent on a developmental timeline. She is the most significant player to wear a Fever uniform in the history of the franchise, and she is in her prime right now, and the decisions being made around her are not prime-worthy decisions. The Aces just got better. That is the simplest summary of what happened in this 24-hour window, and it is worth saying plainly, because organizational comparisons matter when you are trying to understand why some franchises consistently make decisions that compound their competitive advantage, while others consistently make decisions that compound their problems. Las Vegas added Justine Prasad. Las Vegas added Kennedy Carter. Las Vegas already had Aja Wilson, who missed the game Indiana celebrated beating, but who will be back. Las Vegas is coached by Becky Hammond, who is being considered for NBA jobs, operating under ownership that has 7 Super Bowl rings and a demonstrated organizational culture built around winning. The Aces did not get better this week because they outworked Indiana, or outscouted them, or made some brilliant strategic move. They got better because Indiana gave them 2 players for nothing and called it a culture decision. Indiana, meanwhile, enters this next stretch of games thinner at guard than they were before, with their best player on a minutes restriction, with their coaching staff still talking about culture in ways that no longer satisfy anyone who is paying attention, and with a fan base that has moved from frustrated to genuinely alarmed. Not alarmed about this season's win total, alarmed about something bigger. Alarmed about whether the organization surrounding Caitlin Clark is capable of honoring what she represents, maximizing what she can do, and building something around her that is actually worthy of the talent they were handed when she arrived. One comment in that goodbye post captured everything better than any analysis can. A fan wrote simply, "I just wanted to watch Caitlin Clark play basketball. That is it. That is the whole thing. No drama required, no organizational politics, no culture conversations, no roster philosophy debates, just the best player in women's basketball playing basketball in a system designed to make her as good as she can possibly be, surrounded by players who complement her strengths and cover her vulnerabilities, coached by someone whose competitive vision is genuinely aligned with what she brings. That is what the fan base signed up for. That is what they showed up for. That is what sold out arenas and drove ratings and transformed Indiana's commercial identity from an afterthought into a nationally followed story. And instead of that, they're getting minutes restrictions and roster decisions that make no basketball sense, and a coaching staff that celebrates low turnovers on the nights Clark doesn't play, and then waives the shooters when the roster needs to get trimmed.
The question that this entire situation now forces into the open is one that has 2 possible answers, and neither of them is comfortable. Is what is happening in Indiana the product of genuine incompetence, a front office and coaching staff that simply do not see what they're doing clearly enough to understand the consequences? Or is it something more deliberate? Is the culture Stephanie White keeps describing a philosophy that is simply misaligned with winning? Or is it a priority structure that is consciously organized around something other than maximizing what Caitlin Clark can do? Because those two answers lead to very different conclusions. Incompetence is fixable. You change the personnel making the decisions, you install a different philosophy, you rebuild the organizational framework around a clearer competitive vision. It is painful and it costs time, but it is recoverable. The other answer is harder to sit with. If the decisions being made in Indiana are not incompetent, but intentional, if the front office is genuinely prioritizing something other than winning, something that the fan base's most pointed comments are gesturing toward, even if they cannot say it plainly in polite company, then no personnel change fixes it. Then the problem is not the coach, or the GM, or the specific roster construction. The problem is the organizational direction itself. And the only real solution for Clark is the one her fan base is already quietly suggesting. Get out before the prime years are gone. Get out before the environment shapes what she believes is possible, rather than what actually is. Get out and find a franchise that understands the specific once-in-a-generation thing it has been handed and is willing to build everything around honoring it. Clark is expected back on the court. The Fever will play. The rotation will run. Dottis will get her minutes. Clark will get her 20, maybe 25 if everything goes well, and then she will sit. And the fans will watch all of it happen, and the comment sections will fill up again, and the conversation will continue building toward a conclusion that gets harder to avoid with every roster decision that does not make basketball sense. The Aces are better now. Indiana is thinner. Two players who could shoot, who could space the floor, who could give Clark the kind of support a franchise cornerstone deserves. Both of them are gone to a championship contender for nothing. And the one player whose numbers do not justify her security is still in the rotation because she fits the culture, whatever that means, whatever that actually means in practice, in the decisions being made, in the environment being built around the most important player this franchise has ever had. 322 comments on a goodbye post for a player who barely saw the court. The fan base already knows what this is. The only question left is whether the people running Indiana know it too, and whether they care enough about the answer to change anything before the cost of not changing becomes something that cannot be recovered from. Clark's prime does not pause while Indiana figures it out. It is happening right now, and right now, Indiana is waving shooters to a championship contender and calling it culture. The Aces have 7 Super Bowl rings in their ownership box and Becky Hammon on the bench. Indiana has Erica Dottis in the rotation and 322 comments that nobody in the front office is reading carefully enough.